you for staying. That's great. On a Saturday, that's just bloody marvellous. OK, let's have a little start. Just over 20 years, or just under 20 years ago, it was generally held by the psychiatric profession that those who stalked famous people, celebrities, public figures, there was no particular relationship to psychotic illness. And there's a perfectly good reason for that. The studies of stalking in the general population had not revealed any particularly impressive increase or impressive number of stalkers having a major mental disorder. Our own research very much fell in with that. So there was absolutely no reason on what we knew at that time to think that it would be any different for those who stalked kings, queens, presidents, etc. Again, there have been some studies on assassins, but there was nothing there at that time obviously to point to a relationship to psychotic disorder. If they'd known the older literature, by which I mean the late 19th century literature, they might have changed their mind, but by and large, there wasn't much there. The other thing which was quite important was that a big study in the US had suggested that attempts to act on death threats to public figures were not involved or not influenced by whether the person had a serious mental illness or not. Terrorism, well, terrorism at that stage was still thought of in terms of members of organised groups who carried out terrorist activities. And there is no doubt that members of organised terrorist groups do not have an increased rate of significant mental disorder. So if you look at the IRA, if you look at the various groups around the world that have pursued terrorist activities to try and obtain their political ends, the members of those groups do not have high rates of any kind of mental disorder, let alone psychotic disorder. And lone actor massacres, there wasn't much in the literature, and unfortunately what there was said there wasn't any relationship with major mental illness, including my own papers on the topic. Okay, so what's the situation today? Well, because there was a small group of us, Michelle Pathay, myself, Rosie Purcell, started researching stalking in the 90s. And we were fortunate enough to get in early enough to do many of the early big studies on stalkers and their victims, which showed, as I've said, there wasn't much in the way of psychosis to play a part in stalking in the general community. As a result of this research, we were commissioned by the British Home Office, together with some of our British colleagues, to carry out a study on stalking, first of all, of the royal family, and secondly, of parliamentary figures. And the results were a shock. 70% of those who persistently attempted to communicate, threaten, or intrude upon royalty or upon senior politicians were psychotic. 70%. I'm not using that loosely. Almost all of them had a history of treatment for psychotic disorders within the health service. Almost all of them were out of contact with the mental health service. So that was a surprise. Attacks on public figures, we did a big study on attacks on public figures throughout the UK and Europe. And again, if you excluded the attacks by organised terrorist groups, the majority of those who attacked public figures were psychotic. Over 50%, clearly psychotic. If you're making threats to public figures and you're psychotic, you're much more likely to attempt to carry out those threats. That's now absolutely clear. The American research, which has suggested the obvious, has largely suggested the obvious because they actually had discounted mental disorder from the very outset and not looked at it. Lone actor terrorism, this changes the picture. I will now talk about lone actor terrorism, lone actor massacres and the rest. But one of the things that is now becoming clear is the importance of severe mental illness in certain kinds of violence within the general community. It's not surprising it's been taken so long to look at this seriously and to gather the data. There is still, among many mental health professionals, a conviction that there is no association between psychotic disorders and violent behaviour. That is wrong. there is a clear association between psychotic disorder and serious crimes of violence, including homicide. Now, why there is an association is a different question, and not the lecture today, but that there is an association is agreed by every serious researcher in the field. Okay. What I'm going to talk about mainly are these lone actor attacks. These are planned attacks on victims chosen largely at random, in which the perpetrator intends to shoot and kill, or at least not just shoot, but usually shoot and kill as many people as they can. The killings form a single continuous event. They occur usually in public spaces. The killer expects and often desires to die among the victims. And I tend to confine this to episodes where there have been at least 4 victims, 2 of whom die, and that does not include the perpetrator. Ooh, that's a good slide. I must have forgotten that. Oh, there we are. Okay. It's usually a project for murder-suicide, almost always carried out by a male, usually individuals, very small number of couples do it. It serves the idiosyncratic purpose of the killer, and it's an attack on the whole society. A lot of names for it: lone wolf massacre, rampage killings, da-dum, da-dum, da-dum. Autogenic massacres was my name. It didn't catch on. Pity, really. I rather liked it. But unfortunately, if you look up autogenic in the medical indexes, it's all about bugs, little bugs that kill themselves. So it was a bit unfortunate, but never mind. Okay. The methods. Guns are still the commonest method, but at least in Western nations. But if you go to China, for example, where these attacks are relatively common, we don't know how common because they're not terribly forthcoming about that, it's bladed weapons. It's largely axes and various other bladed weapons. Motor vehicles, I think, are the most important one now to look at. An extraordinary outcrop of these attacks using motor vehicles. And it's very important when I come to a later argument of what is it that causes these? What causes them to spread? What is this? It's an infection in many ways. It's imitating, it's mimesis. And more of these attacks involve motor vehicles. Bombs? Yeah, bombs are not that common. Much commoner among organised terrorist groups because they have the technology to do it. But most of these isolates, if they do make a bomb, it finishes up like the one on the tube about this time last year. Goes foot. A few people get sore eyes, and the bloke gets a 20-year sentence. And it's just not the way to go. A combination of the above. If you remember, the attack on Westminster Bridge starts off with a car, finishes up with a knife attack. And the other one, of course, in London, which started off with a car attack and then continued with 2 men with knives. So these things are becoming more common in combination. One of the strange things about this is there is no record of these kinds of events, as I've defined them, occurring in Western civilization before 1913. Been some extensive research into newspaper reports and things. Serial killers, yes. Family massacres, yes. Massacres by troops, yes. One group of citizens killing a lot of other groups of citizens, yes. But the loner going out and killing a group of people and then attempting to kill themselves or getting killed, first ever was 1913. Now, we know that it existed in other societies. The most famous, of course, is amok. And here's a quote from Barbosa, 1594. There are some Javanese, that's the area which we now call Malaysia, who go out into the streets and kill as many persons as they meet until they are also killed. So there was exactly the thing. And who does this, or who did it? I still do it. Young men, loss of face, suicidal, period of brooding. The killing accomplishes their own death by a suicide which is not suicide, and to some extent restores their social prestige. In other words, they cease to be a humiliated, harmless non-entity and become something very, very different. One of the interesting things about Amok was the way in the end, the British colonial administration attempted to deal with it. They deal with it by introducing a policy of capturing and not killing. In other words, depriving them of the suicide which was not suicide, and then humiliating them and their families by putting them in a psychiatric hospital. You can still visit in Johor Bahru the unit which used to be used to hold the Amoks, or the Pengamoks, to use the proper term. It's now a forensic unit. It's special. And it worked. It was dramatic in how it worked. Not necessarily that it has a message for today, but not necessarily does it not have a message for today.